The letter arrived on a Tuesday morning in Boston, and Margaret Owens read it 3 times before her hands stopped shaking enough to set it down on the breakfast table. Her aunt's silence stretched across the room like a tightrope, waiting for Margaret to speak the words that would change everything. The paper promised a ranch in Wyoming Territory, a husband who owned land stretching farther than the eye could see, and a future that glimmered with possibility after 2 years of grief and poverty following her father's death. "I'm going," Margaret said, and her aunt's teacup clattered against its saucer. "Margaret, you cannot be serious. You've never even met this man. Samuel Irving could be anyone, could be lying about everything." Margaret folded the letter carefully, pressing the creases flat with fingers that had grown calloused from taking in laundry and mending. At 23, she had watched her prospects dim like lamplight in the Boston fog. Her father's debts had consumed everything, leaving her dependent on an aunt whose charity grew thinner each month. The advertisement in the matrimonial news had seemed like madness at first, but desperation had a way of making the impossible seem reasonable. "He sent references," Margaret said. "Letters from the banker in Rock Springs, from the general store owner. He owns land, Aunt Martha. Real land. He said he has a home waiting." What she did not say was how the photograph had made her breath catch. Samuel Irving stood tall and serious in front of a wooden building, his hat pushed back just enough to show dark hair and eyes that seemed to look straight through the camera into something beyond. His letters had been simple but honest, talking about the work of building something lasting, about wanting a partner to share the life he was creating. He had written about the mountains and the endless sky, about a territory so new that a person could become whoever they chose to be. The journey west took 17 days by train and stagecoach, each mile carrying Margaret farther from everything she had known. The other passengers changed at every stop, a rotating cast of miners, merchants, and families heading toward promises of their own. She kept Samuel's letters in her reticule, reading them during the long stretches when the landscape turned from green to brown to something so vast and empty. It made her chest tight with wonder and fear. Rock Springs appeared on the horizon like a mirage on the afternoon of September 15th, 1874. The town sprawled along the railroad tracks, a collection of wooden buildings that looked temporary against the backdrop of bluffs and sage-covered hills. Margaret pressed her gloved hand against the stage-coach window, searching the scattered structures for something that might be a mansion, or even a proper house with a second story and painted shutters. The stage lurched to a stop outside the Wells Fargo office, and dust billowed up around the wheels. Margaret gathered her carpet bag and the small trunk that held everything she owned, her heart hammering so hard she could feel it in her throat. The driver helped her down, and she stood on the wooden sidewalk in her traveling dress, suddenly aware of how out of place her Boston clothes looked in this raw Western town. "Miss Owens." The voice came from behind her, and Margaret turned to find the man from the photograph. Samuel Irving stood even taller than she had imagined, lean and sun-browned, with eyes the color of pine bark. He held his hat in his hands, turning it slowly, and something in the gesture made her realize he was as nervous as she was. "Mr. Irving," she said, and her voice came out steadier than she felt. "It's good to finally meet you. Samuel, please." He smiled, and it transformed his serious face into something warmer. "I hope the journey wasn't too difficult." "Long," Margaret admitted, "but I'm here now." He loaded her trunk onto a wagon that looked well used but sturdy, then helped her up onto the seat. The horses were solid workhorses, nothing fancy, and Margaret found herself cataloging these details, building a picture of the life she was stepping into. They rolled through town, passing the general store, 2 saloons, a church still missing its steeple, and a schoolhouse that looked brand new. "The railroad came through 5 years ago," Samuel said, following her gaze. "Town's been growing ever since. Coal mines brought workers, and the workers needed everything else. It's rough still, but it's got good bones." Margaret nodded, watching the buildings thin out as they left the main street behind. She waited for Samuel to turn toward a neighborhood, toward the large houses she imagined wealthy ranchers would build. Instead, the wagon kept rolling out into open country, following a rough track that cut through sage and scattered juniper. "How far is your ranch?" she asked. "About 8 miles from town, far enough for peace and quiet, close enough to get supplies when needed." He glanced at her, then back at the horses. "I should tell you, Margaret, I may have let you build some wrong ideas from my letters." Her stomach dropped. "What do you mean, the land is real?" "I own 320 acres, with water rights to the creek that runs through the property. I've got cattle, about 200 head, and I'm building the herd every year. Everything I told you about the ranch is true." He paused, and the wagon wheels creaked in the silence. "But the house, well, it's not what you might be picturing." They crested a small rise, and Margaret saw the valley spread below them. A creek wound through the bottom, marked by cottonwood trees that glowed gold in the autumn light. Cattle dotted the grassland, moving slowly in the afternoon heat. The land rolled away toward distant bluffs, vast and beautiful and completely untamed. And there, near the creek, stood a cabin, not a house, not a ranch home with multiple rooms and glass windows. A cabin, single story, built from rough-cut logs, with a stone chimney and a porch that looked like it had been added as an afterthought. Margaret felt the dreams she had been building crack and splinter. She had known not to expect a mansion, had told herself to be reasonable, but she had still imagined something substantial, something that looked permanent. This looked like a lined shack, like temporary shelter a person might use while building something better. Samuel stopped the wagon and sat silent, waiting. Margaret realized he was giving her a chance to speak, to object, maybe even to ask him to turn around and take her back to town. She looked at the cabin, at the land stretching in every direction, at the mountains rising purple in the distance. She thought about the $3.40 in her purse, about her aunt's cold parlor in Boston, about the advertisement she had answered in desperation. "It's small," she said finally. "Yes," Samuel's voice was quiet. "I built it 2 years ago, meant it to be temporary while I got the ranch established. I've been putting everything back into the land, into the herd. I know it's not what a woman expects, not what you deserve." Margaret turned to look at him directly. His jaw was tight, and she could see the tension in his shoulders, the way he was bracing for her rejection. But she could also see something else, something in the way he looked at the land, at the cabin, at the future he was trying to build with his own hands. "What were you planning?" she asked. Samuel blinked, surprised by the question. "Planning for the house. Eventually. What were you planning to build?" He stared at her for a moment, then something shifted in his expression. He set the brake and turned on the seat to face her properly. "I've got timber marked up in the hills, been seasoning for a year. I was thinking a proper house, 2 stories with a real kitchen and a parlor. Maybe a room for an office where we could keep books and records. A porch that wraps around at least 2 sides to catch the breeze in summer." His words came faster, like he had been holding this vision inside for so long it spilled out now that someone was finally asking. "I want to build something that will last, something we could fill with family. But it takes time, Margaret. It takes money and time and work." "How long?" she asked. "To build what you're describing." Samuel ran a hand through his hair, making it stand up in different directions. "If I do most of the work myself, maybe 2 years. Less if the cattle prices stay good and I can hire help." 2 years, Margaret repeated. She looked back at the cabin, at the thin line of smoke rising from the chimney, at the garden plot someone had fenced off near the side. Is there furniture inside? A bed, a table, 2 chairs. I built them myself, so they're sturdy if not pretty. There's a stove, and I had a woman from town come out and make sure there were proper linens and kitchen things. He hesitated. I know it's not much. If you want to go back to town, I understand. I can pay for a hotel room while you think things over, or for a ticket back east if that's what you decide. Margaret sat very still, feeling the weight of the decision pressing down on her shoulders. She could go back to Boston, back to taking in laundry and mending, back to being a burden on her aunt's charity. She could stay in Rock Springs and try to find work, though she had no idea what kind of work a single woman could find in a rough mining town. Or she could climb down from this wagon, walk into that small cabin, and begin building something new. She thought about her father, about how he had lost everything chasing dreams that were never quite real. But she also thought about how he had taught her that sometimes the best things were the ones you built yourself, slowly, with patience and care. I didn't come all this way to turn back now, Margaret said. She gathered her skirts and started to climb down from the wagon. Show me the cabin, Samuel. Show me where we start. The relief that flooded Samuel's face was so profound it made Margaret's throat tight. He jumped down and came around to help her, his hands careful as he steadied her descent. For a moment they stood close, and Margaret could smell sage and wood smoke and something clean like soap. Then Samuel stepped back and grabbed her trunk, carrying it toward the cabin like it weighed nothing. The inside was better than Margaret had feared. The single room was clean and surprisingly well organized, with the bed in one corner behind a curtain that could be pulled for privacy, the small kitchen area along one wall, and the main living space dominated by the table and a trunk that apparently served as additional seating. The floor was wood plank, not dirt, and the chinking between the logs looked solid. A small shelf held a few books, and pegs on the wall served as a closet. I'll sleep in the barn tonight, Samuel said, setting her trunk down carefully, until we're properly married. I talked to Reverend Mitchell in town. He can come out tomorrow if you're willing, or we can wait longer if you need time to be sure. Margaret walked slowly around the small space, running her hand along the table edge, noting the care that had gone into every joint and corner. Everything was simple but well made, built to last. She opened the stove and saw that someone had laid a fire ready to light. She checked the small pantry and found it stocked with flour, beans, coffee, salt, and sugar. On the shelf above the dishpan sat a small blue bottle, and when she picked it up, she realized it was perfume, something floral and completely impractical for a ranch cabin. She turned to find Samuel watching her anxiously. "Did you buy this?" she asked, holding up the bottle. He flushed. "I thought, well, I wanted you to have something nice, something that wasn't just practical." The gesture, so thoughtful and so completely unnecessary, made Margaret's eyes sting. She set the bottle down carefully and smoothed her hands over her skirt, trying to organize her thoughts. She had come west to marry a stranger because she had no other choices, but now she was beginning to see that Samuel Irving was not just any stranger. He was a man who built solid furniture and bought impractical perfume, who offered her time and choices, even when it might cost him everything. "Tomorrow is fine," she said. "For the wedding, if the Reverend can come, tomorrow is fine." Samuel's shoulders dropped as tension flowed out of him. "You're sure?" "I'm sure." Margaret looked around the cabin again at the life she was choosing. "But Samuel, I want to be clear about something. I'm not afraid of work. I grew up helping my father with his accounts, managing a household. I can cook and sew and keep house. If we're going to build something here, I want to be part of that building, not just waiting inside while you do everything." "I was hoping you'd say that," Samuel said, and his smile was genuine. "There's a lot of work for two people on a place like this. I could use a partner, Margaret, a real partner." That night, Samuel made dinner while Margaret unpacked her trunk. He cooked steaks from a young steer he had slaughtered the week before, along with beans and cornbread that was only slightly burned on the bottom. They ate at the small table, the silence stretching awkward between them as they tried to figure out how to talk to each other beyond letters and formal politeness. "What made you come west?" Margaret asked finally. "Your letters talked about building a ranch, but not about where you came from." Samuel chewed thoughtfully before answering. "Iowa, originally. My father had a farm, but when he died, it went to my older brother. That's the way it works. The oldest gets everything. I could have stayed on and worked for him, but I wanted something of my own." He looked up at her, his expression serious. "I saved every penny for 3 years, then came out here when they opened the territory for homesteading. Filed a claim, bought additional land from a miner who decided he liked digging for coal better than punching cattle. I've been here 5 years now, and every acre is mine free and clear. No debt, no one to answer to." "That must feel good," Margaret said, "owning something outright." "It does, but it's lonely too." He paused, then continued more carefully. "I'm not much for town socializing. I know that's something you should probably know. I go in for supplies and church when I can make it, but mostly I prefer being out here with the work. If you're someone who needs a lot of company and social calling, you might find it hard." Margaret thought about the endless rounds of tea and visiting that had filled her mother's days, about the careful social dancing that had seemed so important in Boston. "I think I've had enough of society for a while," she said. "My father's death taught me who my real friends were. Most people disappeared as soon as the money was gone. They talked as the light faded outside, sharing pieces of their histories in careful increments." Samuel told her about learning to ranch, about the winter when he had nearly lost everything to cold and wolves, about the satisfaction of seeing calves born healthy in spring. Margaret talked about her father's business failures, about taking in laundry to help pay debts, about the slow erosion of hope that had led her to answer a matrimonial advertisement. When full dark came, Samuel stood and gathered his coat. "I'll be in the barn if you need anything. Just ring the bell on the porch." After he left, Margaret changed into her nightgown and lay in the narrow bed, listening to unfamiliar sounds. Coyotes called in the distance, and something rustled in the grass near the cabin. The wind moved through the cottonwood trees with a sound like water, and the creek murmured its endless conversation. She thought about Samuel sleeping in the barn, about tomorrow's wedding, about the vast, unknown territory her life had become. She did not sleep well, but when dawn light finally seeped through the small window, Margaret rose with a sense of purpose. She dressed carefully in her best dress, dark blue wool that had seen better days but was still respectable. She pinned her brown hair up neatly and allowed herself one drop of the impractical perfume. When she looked in the small mirror Samuel had hung near the wash basin, she saw a woman who looked older than 23, but who also looked ready. Samuel returned from the barn in clean clothes, his hair still damp from washing in the creek. He had shaved, and the formality of the gesture touched Margaret. They were both trying so hard to make this strange situation work. Reverend Mitchell arrived mid-morning, driving his own wagon and bringing his wife as a witness. Martha Mitchell was a round, cheerful woman who immediately took charge, producing a bouquet of late-blooming wildflowers and insisting on arranging them in a tin cup for Margaret to hold. She fussed over Margaret's dress, adjusting the collar and pronouncing her beautiful, which was kind even if it was not strictly true. They stood outside the cabin with the mountains rising behind them and the creek singing nearby. Reverend Mitchell read from his Bible in a voice that carried across the valley, talking about love and commitment, about cleaving together through hardships, about building a life on faith and work. Samuel's hand was warm and slightly rough when he took Margaret's, and when he repeated his vows, his voice was steady and sure. Margaret spoke her own vows clearly, making promises to a man she barely knew but was beginning to understand. When Reverend Mitchell pronounced them married, Samuel bent and kissed her cheek gently, a gesture of respect rather than passion. It would do for now. Martha Mitchell had brought a cake, and they sat at the small table, eating slices and drinking coffee while the Reverend told stories about other couples he had married in the territory. Some had succeeded and built thriving ranches, he said. Some had given up and gone back east. The ones who made it were the ones who learned to work together, who understood that survival out here required both people pulling in the same direction. After the Mitchells left, Margaret and Samuel stood together in the cabin that was now their shared home. The silence felt different now, weighted with new expectations and possibilities. "I should check on the cattle," Samuel said, "but I could show you around first if you'd like. Let you see the whole property." "I'd like that," Margaret said. They walked together through the afternoon, Samuel pointing out boundaries and landmarks, showing her the best grazing areas and the places where the creek pooled deep enough for fish. He showed her the timber he had marked for the future house, tall pines growing on the hillside, and explained how he planned to drag them down come winter when the snow would make the logs slide easier. Margaret asked questions, learning the language of this new life. She learned about the different grasses, about how to read the weather in the shape of clouds over the mountains, about the rhythms of cattle and seasons and survival. Samuel was patient, explaining things without condescension, seeming genuinely pleased by her interest. They returned to the cabin as the sun was setting, painting the sky orange and purple. Margaret started dinner while Samuel tended to the horses, and they moved around each other carefully, two strangers learning to share space. The meal was simple, but they ate together, and the conversation came a little easier now. That night, for the first time, they shared the cabin as husband and wife. Samuel was gentle and careful, and Margaret tried not to think too hard about the strangeness of lying with someone she had known for less than 2 days. It was awkward and uncertain, but there was kindness in it too, and afterward, Samuel held her hand in the darkness and told her thank you, which seemed an odd thing to say but somehow appropriate. The days fell into a pattern quickly. Samuel rose before dawn to tend livestock and manage the countless tasks of running a ranch. Margaret took charge of the cabin and garden, discovering that domestic work felt different when it was for her own home rather than for demanding strangers or a resentful aunt. She cleaned and organized, learning where Samuel kept things and quietly improving the systems. She cooked meals from the supplies in the pantry, stretching ingredients, and learning to work with what was available rather than what she might prefer. A week after the wedding, Samuel asked if she wanted to go into town for supplies. Margaret agreed eagerly, hungry for the sight of other people and the opportunity to explore Rock Springs properly. They loaded the wagon and made the 8-mile journey, talking about what they needed and what they could afford. The general store was a revelation. Margaret met Sarah Porter, the storekeeper's wife, who welcomed her warmly and introduced her to several other women. They were curious but kind, asking careful questions about Boston and her journey west, sharing information about church socials and sewing circles. Margaret found herself relaxing, laughing at stories about life in the territory, feeling the first stirrings of community. Samuel introduced her to William Chen, who ran a restaurant that served miners and railroad workers. William's family had come from China to work on the railroad and had stayed when the work was finished. He spoke perfect English and offered Margaret advice about preserving vegetables for winter, promising to show her his own methods if she wanted to visit. They stopped at the bank, where Margaret met Henry Paulson, the banker who had written one of Samuel's reference letters. Henry was formal but friendly, explaining about the bank's services and assuring Margaret that if she ever needed anything, she should not hesitate to ask. Margaret opened her own account with the $3.40 from her purse, a small gesture of independence that felt important. On the way home, Wagon loaded with flour and coffee and sugar, Samuel said, "You seemed happy today, with the people in town." "I was," Margaret admitted. "It's good to know we're not completely isolated, though I don't mind the quiet at the ranch." "You can go to town whenever you want," Samuel said. "I know it must be lonely sometimes, just me and the cattle and the work." Margaret considered this. "It's different from Boston, certainly. But Samuel, I think I prefer different. At least out here, people are what they seem. There's no pretending, no hiding financial ruin behind fancy curtains." He glanced at her, something warm in his expression. "I'm glad you came, Margaret. I know the cabin isn't what you expected, but I'm glad you stayed anyway." "So am I," Margaret said, and realized she meant it. The weeks passed, and autumn deepened into early winter. Margaret learned to manage the chickens Samuel brought home from town, gathering eggs and protecting the birds from coyotes. She learned to bake bread in the temperamental stove, to render fat for soap, to preserve the deer Samuel shot for meat. Her hands grew rougher, her dresses more practical, and her body stronger from the constant physical work. Samuel taught her to ride the gentler of his 2 horses, and Margaret discovered a love for being on horseback, for the freedom of moving across the open land. They rode together in the evenings sometimes, checking fence lines and counting cattle, and Margaret began to understand the scope of what Samuel was building, the vision behind the small cabin and the careful planning. They talked more easily now, the awkwardness fading as they learned each other's rhythms. Samuel told stories about learning to ranch, about mistakes and successes, about the community of ranchers helping each other through hard times. Margaret talked about books she had read, about her father's love of mathematics, and how she had inherited his head for numbers. She started keeping the ranch books, organizing Samuel's scattered records into a proper ledger, and Samuel was grateful and impressed by her neat columns and careful calculations. One evening in late October, after dinner, Samuel spread papers across the table. "I want to show you something," he said. "The house plans." Margaret leaned over the sketches, recognizing her husband's careful hand in the detailed drawings. He had mapped out a 2-story home with 4 bedrooms, a proper kitchen with a pantry, a dining room, and a parlor. He had marked where windows should go to catch light and cross breezes, where the porch would wrap around, where the stairs would rise to the 2nd floor. "It's beautiful," Margaret said softly. "But Samuel, this is much more than you described. This is a real house." "It's going to be our home," Samuel said. "I want it to be something we can be proud of, something that will shelter our family for generations." He paused, then added quietly, "If we have a family, if that's something you want." Margaret looked at the sketches, at the dreams rendered in pencil and ink. She thought about the careful way Samuel had drawn each room, about the hope contained in those neat lines. "Yes," she said, "that's something I want." Samuel reached across the table and took her hand. "Then I promise you, Margaret, I'll build this. Maybe not this year or next, but I'll build it. You came all this way trusting my word. I won't let you down." Winter arrived in earnest in November, bringing cold winds and early snow. The cabin, which had seemed small and rough in September, now felt cozy and protective. Samuel had chinked every gap and reinforced the windows, and the stove kept the single room warm even on the coldest nights. They spent long evenings together, Samuel working on tack and tools, Margaret sewing or reading aloud from the books on the shelf. The physical intimacy between them had grown more comfortable, less awkward. Margaret found herself drawn to her husband's quiet strength, to the way his hands moved with certainty, to the rare smiles that transformed his serious face. Samuel seemed to relax around her too, sharing more of his thoughts and dreams, touching her more freely, pulling her close on cold nights and holding her like something precious. Christmas came quietly. They could not make the journey to town because of deep snow, so they celebrated alone. Margaret made a special dinner from their limited supplies, and Samuel gave her a shawl he had bought secretly during their last trip to town. Soft wool dyed a beautiful deep red. Margaret gave him a shirt she had sewn from fabric she had been saving, fitting it to his measurements while he slept. They sat together by the stove, listening to wind howl outside, and Margaret realized she was happier than she had been in years. In January, during a brief thaw, Samuel made the trip to town alone for necessary supplies. He returned with flour and coffee and news. 2 more families had arrived in Rock Springs, planning to start ranches. A new hotel was being built, and there was talk of establishing a proper school system. The railroad was expanding operations, which meant more workers and more demand for beef. Cattle prices might go up, Samuel said, excitement clear in his voice. If they do, we could afford to hire some help come spring. Start on the house sooner than I thought. Margaret felt her own excitement rise to match his. How much sooner? Maybe start this summer, have the frame up before next winter. We'd still be living in the cabin, but we could see it taking shape. He pulled her close, his arms around her waist. Are you tired of this little place yet? Margaret looked around the cabin that had become home. It was small and simple, but it held their life together, their growing love, their shared work and dreams. No, she said honestly, but I'm looking forward to the house too, to what we'll build together. February brought a fierce blizzard that trapped them inside for 3 days. They burned through their firewood faster than Samuel liked, rationed their food carefully, and huddled together for warmth. It was uncomfortable and sometimes frightening, listening to the wind scream and watching snow pile against the walls, but it was also intimate. They talked for hours, sharing stories and secrets, learning each other in ways that went beyond the physical. When the storm finally broke and Samuel could dig his way out to check on the livestock, Margaret discovered she was pregnant. The realization came gradually, pieces of evidence adding up until she could not deny it. She waited until evening, until dinner was finished and they were sitting together by the stove, before she told Samuel. He stared at her for a long moment, then whooped and grabbed her, spinning her around until she was dizzy and laughing. A baby, he kept saying. We're going to have a baby. Come fall, Margaret said, her hands on her still flat stomach. October, I think. Samuel's face went through several expressions at once, joy and fear and wonder mixing together. We need to build the house, he said. Before the baby comes, we need more space, a real home. We have time, Margaret said. And Samuel, babies are small. We can manage in the cabin if we need to. But Samuel was already planning, already calculating. That night he redrew his sketches, adjusting the plans to prioritize getting the main floor finished first. They could live on the main floor, he said, and finish the second story later. But he wanted the kitchen and at least 2 bedrooms done before the baby arrived. March brought mud and melting snow and the first signs of spring. Samuel was a man possessed, working from dawn until dark, using the daylight to accomplish everything possible. He hired 2 men from town, young railroad workers looking for extra money, and they began the work of preparing the house site. Margaret watched the preparations with mixed emotions. She was excited about the house, but worried about the cost and the work involved. Samuel kept assuring her the money was there. The cattle prices had been good, but Margaret tracked every expense in her ledger and felt anxious watching their savings diminish. In April, they began hauling logs from the hillside. It was brutal work, even with the hired help and 2 teams of horses. Samuel came home each evening exhausted and sore, but his eyes shone with purpose. The logs piled up near the house site, a raw promise of the future taking shape. Margaret tried to help where she could, but morning sickness plagued her through the early months. She hated feeling useless, hated watching Samuel work so hard while she struggled with the smallest tasks. But Samuel was patient and kind, bringing her water when she was sick, insisting she rest when she felt dizzy, telling her that growing their child was the most important work she could be doing. By May, the foundation was laid, stone and mortar arranged in a rectangle that looked impossibly large after months in the small cabin. Samuel worked with fierce concentration, measuring and remeasuring, making sure everything was level and square. The hired men returned and they began raising the frame. Margaret brought lunch to the worksite each day, watching the house take shape board by board, beam by beam. It was exciting and terrifying, seeing their dreams become real, substantial, permanent. The frame rose against the sky, raw wood that would become walls and rooms and shelter. In June, with the frame complete and the roof beginning to take shape, Samuel sent the hired men back to town. Money was running lower than he liked, and he wanted to do the finish work himself anyway. He worked long hours, and Margaret worked beside him when she could, steadying boards and fetching tools, feeling the baby grow inside her as the house grew around them. They put up walls and cut windows, installed the door frames, and began on the floors. Samuel was meticulous, measuring twice and cutting once, making sure every joint was tight and every board was secure. He worked through the heat of summer, through afternoon thunderstorms and long, exhausting days. Margaret sewed curtains from fabric Sarah Porter helped her select, choosing cheerful patterns that would bring light into the new rooms. She planned where furniture would go, how they would arrange their life in this expanded space. She felt the baby kick and move, growing stronger as the house grew more complete. By August, the main floor was livable. The kitchen was finished enough to cook in. 2 bedrooms had doors and windows, and the parlor needed only trim work. Samuel wanted to do more before they moved in, but Margaret was tired of the cramped cabin, tired of trying to preserve food in the inadequate pantry, tired of having nowhere to sit except the bed or the 2 chairs. They moved on a Sunday, carrying their few possessions across the 100 yards from cabin to house. The furniture Samuel had built looked small in the larger rooms, but Margaret did not care. She had a real kitchen with a big stove and counter space. She had a bedroom with a proper closet. She had windows that let in light and air, and a porch where she could sit in the evenings and watch the sun set over the mountains. That first night in the new house, they lay in bed in their new bedroom, listening to unfamiliar creaks and settling sounds. Samuel held Margaret close, his hand on her swollen belly, feeling their child move. "I kept my promise," he said softly. "It's not finished yet, but I built you more than a cabin." "You did," Margaret agreed. "You built us a home." The weeks before the baby's arrival were a blur of preparation. Margaret sewed tiny clothes and blankets, washed and rewashed everything, arranged and rearranged the small cradle Samuel had built. Sarah Porter visited from town, bringing advice and supplies, promising to come help when the time arrived. Samuel finished the trim work in the main rooms and started on the second floor, but mostly he stayed close, anxious about leaving Margaret alone. The baby arrived on an October evening, 3 days before Margaret's 24th birthday. The labor was long and difficult, and there were moments when Margaret was certain she could not continue, could not endure another minute of the pain. But Sarah Porter was there, solid and competent, and Samuel held Margaret's hand and told her she was strong, she could do this, just a little more. When the baby finally emerged, wailing and red-faced, Samuel wept openly. "A boy," Sarah announced, placing the tiny, perfect infant in Margaret's arms. "You have a son." They named him James after Margaret's father, and Samuel held him with shaking hands, his face full of wonder. Margaret watched her husband fall in love with their child, watched the way he touched the tiny fingers and marveled at each miniature feature, and felt her heart expand to hold this new, overwhelming love. The first months with a baby were harder than Margaret had expected. James was colicky and woke frequently, and Margaret was exhausted in a way she had never experienced. But Samuel helped, walking the baby at night so Margaret could sleep, changing diapers without complaint, doing whatever was needed. They stumbled through together, learning as they went, making mistakes and finding solutions. Winter came again, their second together, and the new house proved its worth. They had space to move, to escape each other when tension rose, to come together when they needed comfort. The stove in the kitchen kept the main floor warm, and they closed off the upstairs to conserve heat. In February, when James was 4 months old and sleeping better, Samuel returned to work on the house. He finished the second floor slowly, building 2 more bedrooms and a small sitting area. It was more than they needed now, but he was thinking ahead, planning for more children, for the family they were creating. Spring brought relief from the cabin fever of winter, and Margaret emerged from the fog of new motherhood to rediscover her husband. Samuel had worked so hard, had given so much to building their home and supporting their family. She found herself watching him with James, seeing the gentle patience, the fierce protectiveness, the deep love. She fell in love with him all over again, deeper this time, rooted in shared experience and weathered hardships. One evening in April, after putting James to bed, Margaret found Samuel on the porch, looking out at the land. She sat beside him, taking his hand. "Do you ever regret it?" she asked. "Answering the advertisement. Getting a stranger instead of someone you could have courted properly?" Samuel turned to look at her, his eyes serious. "Margaret, you came by Wagon expecting a mansion, and I showed you a cabin and promised to build you more. You could have left, could have gone back to Boston or stayed in town and found someone with more to offer. But you stayed. You worked beside me, believed in what we could build together. How could I regret that?" He lifted her hand to his lips, kissing her knuckles gently. "I love you. I should have said it before now, but I love you." Margaret felt tears sting her eyes. "I love you too. I think I started falling in love with you that first day when you were so nervous and honest about the cabin, when you gave me the choice to stay or go." They sat together in the growing darkness, listening to the creek and the wind, to their son's soft breathing through the open window. They had built something real here, something lasting. Not just a house, but a life, a family, a future. The years unfolded with the rhythm of ranch life. James grew from infant to toddler to small boy, running through the house and following his father around the ranch. Sarah arrived in the spring of 1877, named for Sarah Porter, who had become Margaret's closest friend. She was an easy baby, cheerful and content, and James adored his little sister. Samuel finished the house completely. adding details and improvements as money allowed. He painted the exterior white with green trim, built a proper barn to replace the old one, and fenced the areas around the house for safety and gardens. The ranch prospered as the territory grew, cattle prices staying strong, the herd increasing steadily. Margaret established her own routines and contributions. She kept the books meticulously, managing their finances and catching errors before they became problems. She planted extensive gardens and learned to preserve everything they grew, filling the pantry with jars of vegetables and fruits. She joined the sewing circle in town and made friends among the other ranch wives, building a community of support and shared experience. In 1879, when James was 4 and Sarah was 2, Margaret discovered she was pregnant again. Samuel was delighted, though he worried about how they would manage 3 children. But Margaret felt confident now, experienced, ready for another baby. Thomas arrived in January of 1880, a winter baby who came easily and quickly compared to his siblings. He was named for Samuel's father, a gesture of reconciliation with a past Samuel rarely discussed. Thomas had his father's dark hair and serious eyes, and Samuel doted on his youngest son with obvious devotion. The house filled with the noise and chaos of children. Margaret and Samuel learned to find moments of privacy and connection amid the demands of parenting, stealing kisses in the kitchen, talking late at night after the children were asleep, maintaining the partnership that was the foundation of everything they had built. Rock Springs continued to grow around them. The town gained proper schools, more churches, additional businesses. The railroad expanded, and with it came more settlers, more opportunities, more challenges. Samuel was elected to the town council, representing the interests of local ranchers, and Margaret served on the school board, working to improve education opportunities for all the children in the area. In 1882, Samuel built a bunkhouse for hired hands, acknowledging that the ranch had grown beyond what 2 people could manage alone. He hired a young man named Peter to help with daily work, and later added 2 more hands during busy seasons. The ranch employed people, contributed to the local economy, became one of the established operations in the region. Margaret sometimes thought back to that September day in 1874, when she had first seen the small cabin and felt her dreams crumble. She thought about how close she had come to leaving, to giving up before she had even started. The mansion she had imagined in her desperate Boston loneliness had been replaced by something better, something real and earned and shared. One evening in the summer of 1885, Margaret and Samuel sat on the porch of the house they had built together. The children were playing near the creek under Peter's watchful eye. James was nearly 11 now, tall and capable, already talking about someday running the ranch himself. Sarah was 8, independent and fearless, spending more time outside than in. Thomas was 5, gentle and thoughtful, more likely to be found with a book than a rope. "You remember that first day?" Margaret asked. "When you showed me the cabin," Samuel laughed. "I thought you were going to tell me to turn the wagon around. You had this look on your face like you were trying very hard not to cry." "I was trying very hard not to cry," Margaret admitted. "I had built up such fantasies about what I would find here. The reality was harder. And now—" Margaret looked at the house, at the barn and the corrals, at the land stretching toward the mountains. She looked at their children, healthy and happy and loved. She looked at her husband, older now, with lines around his eyes and gray starting in his hair, but still strong, still steady, still the man who had promised to build her more and had kept his word. "Now I wouldn't change anything," Margaret said. "You showed me a cabin and promised to build me more, Samuel. But what you really did was invite me to build something with you, to be your partner in creating all of this." She gestured at the life spread around them. "That's worth more than any mansion." Samuel pulled her close, kissing her temple. "You made it all possible, Margaret. I had land and plans, but you made it a home. You made it a life worth living." They sat together as the sun set, painting the sky in brilliant colors. The creek sang its eternal song. The cattle moved slowly across the pastures, and their children's laughter carried on the evening breeze. It was not the life Margaret had imagined when she had answered that advertisement 11 years ago. It was better. The years continued to pass, each one adding layers to the life they had built. James grew into a fine young man, taking on more responsibility at the ranch, learning everything Samuel could teach him. He went to school in town during winters but worked the ranch every summer, proving himself capable and dedicated. By 1890, at 16, he was essentially Samuel's full partner in managing the operation. Sarah surprised everyone by developing a talent for horses. She could gentle the wildest bronc, had an intuition for understanding what an animal needed. Samuel built her a separate corral for her training work, and she began earning her own money breaking horses for neighboring ranches. Margaret worried about the danger, but Sarah was careful and skilled, and Samuel trusted her judgment. Thomas pursued education with the same intensity his siblings brought to ranch work. He devoured every book Margaret could find for him, excelled in school, and talked about maybe going to university someday. Samuel and Margaret encouraged him, understanding that not every child was meant to follow the same path, that Thomas's contributions to the family might look different but would be equally valuable. In 1892, the territory was gearing up for statehood. Wyoming would become the 44th state, and there was excitement and celebration throughout the region. Samuel and Margaret attended the statehood ceremonies in Cheyenne, bringing all 3 children, wanting them to witness this historic moment. They stood together as the flag was raised, as speeches were made about progress and opportunity, and Margaret thought about how much had changed since she had arrived 18 years ago. The ranch continued to prosper through the 1890s, despite economic challenges that affected much of the country. Samuel's careful management and Margaret's meticulous bookkeeping kept them stable even when other operations struggled. They weathered droughts and harsh winters, disease in the herd and fluctuating prices, but they endured and adapted. In 1895, James married Lucy Peterson, daughter of a neighboring rancher. It was a good match, 2 young people who had grown up in the territory, who understood ranch life and shared similar values. Samuel and Margaret built a small house on the property for the newlyweds, creating space for the next generation while keeping the family close. Sarah continued her work with horses, becoming known throughout the region for her skill. She had suitors, but she claimed she was too busy to bother with courtship, though Margaret suspected her independent daughter was waiting for someone who would respect her abilities rather than try to change her. Thomas earned a scholarship to the University of Wyoming when it opened in Laramie. Samuel and Margaret were proud beyond words, seeing their youngest son pursue education, knowing he would bring new knowledge and ideas back to the family. Thomas talked about studying law, about maybe serving the state in some official capacity, and his parents encouraged him to follow his dreams. The turn of the century found Samuel and Margaret in their 50s, still active and involved in the ranch, but gradually shifting more responsibility to James and the hired hands. They had accomplished everything they had set out to do and more. The ranch was thriving, their children were settled and successful, and the community they had helped build was strong and growing. One afternoon in the spring of 1900, Margaret was working in her garden when she heard the sound of a wagon approaching. She straightened, shading her eyes, and saw Samuel driving up from the south pasture. He pulled up near the house and jumped down with the energy of a much younger man. "Come with me," he said, grinning. "I want to show you something." "Samuel Irving, I'm covered in dirt and have work to do." "It can wait. Please, Margaret, come with me." Curious, Margaret brushed off her hands and climbed up beside him. Samuel drove them out past the big house, past the barn and corrals, to a small rise that overlooked the entire valley. And there, newly painted and looking exactly as it had 26 years ago, stood the cabin. "You fixed it up," Margaret said, surprised. "I did more than that. Look inside." They climbed down, and Margaret walked through the door of the cabin where she had spent her first months as Samuel's wife. But it was completely different now. Samuel had refinished the floors, replaced the windows, and furnished it beautifully with new pieces. There was a comfortable bed with a colorful quilt, a table with 4 chairs, a small stove, and shelves filled with books. Curtains hung at the windows, and flowers sat in a vase on the table. "I thought we could use a retreat," Samuel said from behind her. "Someplace quiet, away from the main house and all the activity. Somewhere we can come when we want to remember where we started, or when we just need peace and quiet." Margaret turned to look at her husband, this man who had kept every promise, who had built her so much more than a mansion. "Samuel, this is perfect." "I wanted you to know that I haven't forgotten," he said quietly. "That first day when you looked at this cabin and saw how small and rough it was, but stayed anyway. That took courage, Margaret. That took faith. Everything we've built together started right here in this little cabin." Margaret crossed the small space and took his hands. "We built a good life, didn't we?" "The best life," Samuel agreed. "And we're not done yet. We've got grandchildren to spoil and more years ahead of us." James and Lucy's first child, a daughter they named Margaret, had arrived the previous fall. Sarah had finally met someone who matched her spirit, a horse trainer from Montana, and they were planning a wedding for summer. Thomas would graduate from university soon and was already being courted by law firms in Cheyenne. The family was growing and changing, but the foundation remained strong. They spent that afternoon in the cabin, talking and remembering, laughing about mistakes and marveling at how much had changed. They made love in the comfortable bed, unhurried and familiar, still finding joy in each other after 26 years of marriage. As evening approached, they sat on the porch of the little cabin, watching the sun set exactly as they had watched it set thousands of times from the big house. Margaret leaned against Samuel's shoulder, feeling content and grateful and deeply, permanently happy. "I came by wagon expecting a mansion," she said softly, "and you showed me a cabin and said you'd build me more." "Did I build you enough?" Samuel asked, his arm around her shoulders. Margaret thought about everything they had created together. The house that held their family, the ranch that provided their livelihood, the children who would carry their legacy forward, the love that had grown deeper and stronger with each passing year. She thought about the community they had helped build, the friends they had made, the life they had carved out of raw territory through work and faith and partnership. "You built me everything," Margaret said. "Everything that matters." They sat together as darkness fell, two people who had started as strangers brought together by circumstance and desperation, who had chosen to build something beautiful together. The cabin stood behind them, a reminder of humble beginnings. The big house waited below, full of memories and promise. And the land stretched away in all directions, the land they had worked and nurtured, the land that had given them everything. Samuel had kept his promise. He had built her more, so much more than she had ever dreamed possible. But the real gift was not the house or the ranch, or even the family they had created. The real gift was the partnership, the love that had grown from careful beginnings into something unshakable and enduring. As stars began to appear in the darkening sky, Margaret and Samuel rose and walked hand in hand down the hill toward the lights of the big house, where their family waited. Behind them, the cabin stood quiet and content, a testament to where they had started. Ahead of them, the house they had built together blazed with light and life, a promise kept, a dream fulfilled, a love story written in wood and stone and years of devotion. They had come so far from that September afternoon when a desperate young woman had stepped down from a wagon and chosen to trust a stranger with her future. They had built a ranch, raised a family, and created a legacy that would endure for generations. But most importantly, they had built a life together. Two people who had learned that the best mansions are not given but earned, not inherited but created with patience and work and unwavering commitment. Margaret had come west as a stranger, seeking survival. She had found love instead, and partnership, and a home that was so much more than walls and windows. She had found everything she had never known to dream of, built board by board, day by day, with the steady, faithful man who had promised to build her more and had spent a lifetime keeping that promise.